Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have you all joining us. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in so that we can do our presentation and have a good time for some robust Q&A at the end of this. So we are very excited to share our 2024 annual progress report for Vermont on emissions, energy equity, and the economy with you. We've just had this printed, and paper copies of the report will be arriving in your mailbox sometime in the next week or two. So you can be looking out for that. And for any of you who don't know me, I'm Cara Robacek. I'm the Deputy Director and Network Manager of Energy Action Network. And I'm going to be presenting on the report with my colleagues Lena Steer and Jared Duval. One quick administrative note before we get started, logistical note before we get started is please put any questions that arise as we're speaking in the chat, and we will have time at the end for our Q&A and to answer some of those questions. So add questions in the chat as they arise. So really quickly about Energy Action Network. So EAN is really two things. We are both a network and an organization. The EAN network is made up of hundreds of public sector, nonprofit, utility, business, and higher education partners who are working collaboratively to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future. As an organization, EAN is a small nonprofit with a staff of 3, and we have a separate mission. That mission is to ensure that Vermont makes evidence-based energy and climate decisions that are grounded in high-quality data and analysis, and collaboratively developed for effective and durable progress. So our annual progress report for Vermont, this report that we're talking about today, is one of the key ways that the EAN staff supports the network and the state of Vermont. In this report, each year, we share the latest data and high-quality analysis to ground and inform Vermont's energy and climate conversation. We produce the report because we believe that constructive progress toward Vermont's energy and climate commitments must begin with a careful, fact-based assessment of the latest evidence. So the report includes the latest available data from many official sources, local to international. And we're always very, very grateful to the diverse array of data providers and reviewers who make the report possible. So diving right into the report. Today, we're going to share our key findings and a number of the graphics from the report. And the 6 key findings we have in the report this year are that climate disruption is here, true resilience requires adaptation and mitigation, delaying action is costly, getting off fossil fuels benefits Vermont's economy, health, and more. Vermont is often a leader, but not always, and progress requires policy. So starting from that first key finding, climate disruption is here. We're all aware of this. Across the Northeast, extreme precipitation events have increased more than 60% over the last 60 years. We all know what this looks like in Vermont. Unfortunately, we've seen severe flooding 2 years in a row. And yet the latest National Climate Assessment projects that the amount of rain on the wettest days in Vermont could increase yet another 20 to 25% in the coming decades under a 2 degrees Celsius warming scenario. And as I say this, our deepest sympathies also go out to people in other parts of the country and the world who are experiencing these effects of climate disruption right now, with North Carolina and Florida particularly on our minds today. So Vermont experienced 20 federally declared climate disasters between 2011 and 2023. This is the 7th highest number of any state in the US. And Vermont also had the 5th highest per capita disaster costs as measured in federal assistance dollars. Washington County, Vermont actually tied for the 2nd highest number of climate-related federal disaster declarations from all counties in the entire United States. And when these disasters strike, the areas with higher levels of social vulnerability tend to have fewer resources to recover from these events. Social vulnerability is a measure of factors like poverty, a lack of access to transportation, and crowded housing that can weaken a community's ability to prevent human suffering and financial loss in a disaster. So if you're looking at the at the map on the right side, counties with a darker color on the map have higher levels of social vulnerability. But it's also interesting to point out that the US national average for social vulnerability is higher than the vulnerability of any Vermont county. Globally, 2023 was by far the hottest year ever recorded. In fact, the top 10 hottest years on record have all been in the last decade. And unfortunately, the extreme temperatures continued on into 2024. So for 15 months straight, from June 2023 to August 2024, every single month set a new record for average monthly global temperatures. It looks like that trend may have broken last month in September, but I haven't seen the data from NASA yet. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Lena.
Great, thank you. My name is Lena Steer. I'm EAN's data manager and research analyst. And I'm going to jump into key finding 2, which is true resilience requires mitigation and adaptation. And this does relate to the last few slides as well, with seeing hotter temperatures across the globe. We're also experiencing these hotter temperatures here in Vermont. So this graph shows Burlington as an example, which has seen more extreme heat days in recent years. And extreme heat in Vermont is defined as at or above 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So this graph shows that the average number of annual extreme heat days in Burlington has increased by about 140% since 1960. And extreme heat creates serious health and safety risks, especially for those who don't have air conditioning, older Vermonters, and those with existing medical conditions. So given these climate impacts that we're seeing globally and here in Vermont, investing in adaptation and resilience is necessary. And there are many examples of actions that are both mitigation and adaptation solutions, meaning that they both reduce climate pollution and also help to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So as shown here, heat pumps are one of those examples. They can provide cooling in the summer months, and in addition to that, they can also provide heat in the winter, displacing fossil fuel use. So as Vermont experiences more extreme heat days, the cooling ability of heat pumps will become increasingly important, not just for comfort, but also as a life-saving health and safety measure. And resilience is also an important part of the conversation when it comes to electrification. We often hear questions like, how will the electricity grid handle all of the electrification, or what happens during power outages if we electrify everything? And this graph shows summer and winter peak electricity loads over the last decade through 2023. And it shows that there is actually considerable headroom for additional electricity load during peak periods. You can see the gap between where those bars are and the dotted lines showing the peak capacity. Velco's long-range transmission plan models the impact that additional electrification of transportation and heating is expected to have on the transmission and distribution system in Vermont. And they found that without additional management strategies or load management strategies, many of which are already happening and being planned for in Vermont, these peak loads would be forecasted to exceed the current system capacity in the next decade or so as we continue to electrify. So that's what is shown on those lighter colored blue and orangey red lines there. And we do have a number of strategies available and already being deployed in Vermont to manage electricity demand during peak periods. And that includes energy storage, virtual power plants, managed EV charging, preheating or pre-cooling, etc. And the graph on the left illustrates how these strategies can be used to flatten the load curve, or in other words, reduce electricity demand during these peak periods. And this is important also because it has cost benefits and climate pollution benefits, as the electricity supply tends to be more expensive and less clean or renewable during peak periods. The graph on the right here shows Vermont's deployment of battery storage capacity since 2014. And we can see that in the last decade or so, that has increased significantly. As of 2023, Vermont's battery storage capacity has been about half utility scale and half small scale residential storage. So continuing to build out these energy storage and demand management strategies will help to ensure the reliability and resilience of Vermont's electricity grid, especially as we continue to rely more on these intermittent generation resources like wind and solar. And we cannot achieve resilience without also mitigating or reducing the climate polluting GHG emissions that we produce. So this gets back to the kind of core message of this key finding that true resilience requires both adaptation and mitigation. Vermont has a responsibility to reduce our emissions in line with science-based targets, and the GWSA, or the Global Warming Solutions Act, that was passed in 2020, was really intended to ensure that Vermont does our part towards that responsibility. As of the latest greenhouse gas inventory that's produced each year by the Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont's total emissions in 2021, which is the latest year that we have data for, were 8.28 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Aside from in 2020, which Vermont's emissions kind of dropped significantly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, 2021 emissions were the lowest that they've been since we began tracking emissions in 1990. So some progress has been made, but we're not currently on track to meet these emissions reduction requirements that are shown in the lighter shaded colors there. And another interesting way of looking at our climate pollution over time is via these measures of emissions intensity. So that's emissions per capita or emissions per GDP. And while overall emissions have declined 16% since 2005, which you can see in the orange line on this graph, Vermont's emissions per capita have declined even more, 19%, and emissions per dollar of GDP by nearly 50%. And this is because our overall emissions are declining even as Vermont's population and Vermont's economy are growing, which GDP is shown in green up here and population in blue there. And then reducing emissions in the highest polluting sectors, which are transportation and thermal, as you can see in the green and the orange here, is really key to achieving our climate requirements. These two sectors in 2021 made up 70% of our total statewide emissions. And while, as I said before, our overall emissions declined 16% between 2005 and 2021, this graph really shows that some sectors saw much larger reductions or smaller reductions than others. So in the orange here, the thermal or building sector, or residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, as it's called in the greenhouse gas inventory, only declined by 8% during that time period, which really emphasizes the need for additional policy action in that sector. And this is just another way of looking at the energy sectors in terms of energy use and emissions. You can see here as well what I mentioned previously, that the transportation and thermal sectors together account for 70% of our GHG emissions, but they also account for the vast majority of energy use and energy expenditures. And then diving into those two key sectors, these pie charts illustrate where the emissions are coming from within those sectors. More than half of the climate pollution from the thermal or building sector comes from residential energy use, which is shown on the left-hand side in the purple shaded area, with another 35% coming from the commercial sector, which is shown in blue. And these emissions primarily are coming from the combustion of fuel oil, propane, and fossil gas or natural gas that's used to heat our homes and buildings in Vermont. And then on the right side, this pie chart is showing that in the transportation sector, almost 70% of emissions are coming from motor gasoline use. So that's on-road and non-road motor gasoline use. But within all on-road transportation emissions, so including both gasoline and diesel, nearly 90% of those emissions come from the light-duty vehicle fleet. So that really tells us that reducing climate pollution from our personal vehicles can have a huge impact on our overall emissions in the transportation sector and across the economy. One of the topics that we explore in the report related to transportation is how future development in Vermont can be done in a way that creates more sustainable communities and helps to reduce transportation-related climate pollution. Vermont is currently facing a housing shortage, and VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, projects that Vermont will need 24,000 to 36,000 more year-round homes by 2030. So while this is a big challenge, it also presents an opportunity to shape how that future development happens in Vermont. And this graph shows the results of a recent Vermont study from the Vermont Agency of Transportation on smart growth and VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, and their impact on Vermont's GHG emissions. And it found that while concentrating our future growth in already developed towns and village centers, which is shown on the left-hand bars, can achieve annual emissions reductions of 8,000 to 13,000 metric tons. And on the other hand, if that development happens in a way that doesn't align with these smart growth principles of concentrating in already developed centers, it could lead to a significant increase in emissions. So I'm going to pass it over to Jared for the next key finding.
Thanks, Lena, and thank you everybody for joining today. My name is Jared Duval, EAN's Executive Director, and I'm going to talk about key finding 3, and this is that delaying action is costly. So often we hear the question, how much will it cost to combat climate change? We believe that a question that is at least as important to ask is, what is the cost of inaction? Because when we don't act, we recognize that that is also a choice that has real costs and consequences. And so we included in the report this year analysis that draws on a concept called the social cost of greenhouse gases. And this helps us answer that cost of inaction question in a comprehensive evidence-based way. So the social cost of greenhouse gases represent the monetary value of the net harm to society from emitting a metric ton of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in a given year. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recently provided estimates of the social cost of greenhouse gases in response to the National Academy of Sciences request to update those figures. And the EPA estimates are that the social cost of emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the year 2020 was $190 a ton. So we use that data to look at if Vermont meets our Global Warming Solutions Act obligations over the next 30 years, we know that we would avoid about 100 million metric tons of greenhouse gas pollution relative to what our 2021 annual emissions were. And that would equate to preventing more than $25 billion in societal costs and damages. We can also bring this down to a personal level. And that means, so for instance, when a Vermont driver switches from a gasoline vehicle to an electric vehicle, over the life of the vehicle, that avoids more than $7,000 in costs and damages from the gas car's climate pollution. But that avoided social cost, societal cost, the avoiding putting those costs onto society is in addition to very real individual consumer savings that also are a benefit of things like electric vehicles. And so we calculated, based on the fuel savings and on the maintenance savings, on average, an electric vehicle saving $9,500 on fuel and maintenance over the life of it as compared to a comparable gas vehicle. And that is thanks in large part to the better efficiency of electric vehicles and the lower costs of electricity as a fuel source and of maintenance of EVs as compared to gas cars. So we developed this new visual to help represent that there are many benefits of reducing climate pollution that go beyond just climate responsibility, and that there are win-win-win opportunities from a social, environmental, and economic perspectives that go along with this action. Here's an example on the economic side. So gasoline and diesel, which you see in the blue and in the orange, they are consistently higher cost and more price volatile than electricity when compared on a gallon equivalent basis. So vehicle charging at average electric rates in Vermont is equivalent to paying about $1.71 a gallon for gasoline. But if you actually look at the price of gasoline right now, it's about $1.50 higher than that. The statewide average this week or last week was about $3.20 a gallon. But those equivalent EV rates can be even lower through the many programs that are offered for off-peak charging by certain utilities. So Burlington Electric Department, for instance, has an EV rate that's equivalent to paying only 94 cents a gallon, and Green Mountain Power's EV rate is equivalent to about $1.20 a gallon. And this is one of the main reasons that EV drivers usually save hundreds of dollars a year on fuel costs. So it's a similar story with heating fuels. Fossil heating fuels like propane, fuel oil, and kerosene are high cost and price volatile. You see those on the right-hand side with propane in gray, fuel oil in purple, for instance. And when we switch away from fossil fuel-dependent heating equipment towards things like cold climate heat pumps and advanced wood heat, there's an opportunity to significantly lower household energy costs while providing much more stable and predictable heating prices. And this is especially important because the unpredictable heating costs that you see on those roller coaster-like lines for kerosene, propane, and fuel oil are especially challenging to Vermonters with lower incomes who face higher energy cost burdens and energy insecurity. We also feel that making sure that Vermonters have accurate information about energy costs is a really important consumer protection issue. We added a graph this year that you see on the left there, which illustrates why, for instance, you can't just compare fossil heating fuels by their price per gallon, because often they have different energy content or heating ability. So for instance, while the price per gallon of propane has historically been lower than the price per gallon of fuel oil, the price for the amount of delivered heat has historically been lower for fuel oil. And that's because propane only has about 60% as much energy per gallon as fuel oil. And I think now it's back to Cara.
Right. And just following on from what Jared was saying, getting away from both the volatile prices and also increasing access to good consumer information are especially important for those households that have lower incomes. Vermont households with lower incomes typically use less energy than those with higher incomes, but they face far higher energy burdens, which means that they spend a higher percentage of their income on energy costs. So they use less energy, but they spend a higher percentage of their income on it. Vermont households with the lowest incomes can spend 19% of their income on just heating fuel and electricity, while households that are at or above the area median income typically spend less than 4% of their income on heating and fuel costs. Heating fuel and electricity costs. And this same trend applies to transportation fuel costs, with households with lower incomes spending a much higher share of their income on gasoline. At the household level, transitioning away from fossil fuels to electric options for space heating, water heating, and transportation can result in significant cost savings each year. And of course, each home is different, but beneficial electrification has the potential to reduce household energy expenditures by a third or even more. This new graph that we've put together this year shows an example of a single-family household that could save more than $2,000 a year in energy costs by switching away from propane heat and gas-powered vehicle to efficient electric alternatives. However, households have to be prepared for changes in billing and payment after electrification. So a typical Vermont household might be used to paying for gasoline weekly or bi-weekly, and for heating fuel 3 or 4 times per winter. After replacing a gasoline car with an electric car and a propane or oil heating system with a cold climate heat pump, all of the household's energy expenses will now appear on their monthly electric bill. Their electric bill will go up, possibly significantly, even as their overall costs across all their energy bills are lower. And consumers really need to be prepared for and understand this change, because we often hear that people are startled by their new electricity bill. So why will households save money through electrification? In a word, the answer is efficiency. Modern electric technology is more energy efficient than combustion. Heat pumps and EVs use far less energy to perform the same tasks. So looking at heating, heat pumps achieve efficiency rates greater than 100% because the energy input is used to transfer rather than generate heat. This allows heat pumps to achieve average efficiencies that are 3 or 4 times greater than combustion-based heating appliances. And in the second graph here, looking at cars, most of the energy used by internal combustion is wasted via heat and other energy losses, with less than a quarter of the total energy delivered to the wheels. In an electric vehicle, that's very different. So the same amount of energy that moves a fossil vehicle 1 mile can move an electric vehicle 4 miles. This is a big reason why it costs so much less to fuel an EV than a gasoline vehicle. Okay, looking at another example of a piece of technology, heat pump water heaters cost less to install and run over their lifetime than propane water heaters. This is true even when the installed equipment price of a fossil fuel water heater is lower because of the lower cost to run the efficient electric alternative over its lifetime. So depending on the incentive level, heat pump water heaters start saving Vermonters money either right away or within 3 years of installation compared to propane water heaters. This is important because more than 20,000 Vermonters replace their water heaters each year, and this time when they are choosing their new piece of equipment is a key moment to replace old dirty systems with more efficient and cleaner upgrades. And it's also the time when they can avoid locking in decades of further pollution and high and unpredictable costs. One more example looking at vehicles. So the Vermonters who use the most gasoline can save the most on fuel costs when they switch to an electric vehicle. In this new graph, we're looking at high gasoline users and comparing those to average gasoline users or typical gasoline users. So a high gasoline user can save more than $4,000 a year when they switch to an EV, and that compares to a little under $1,000 per year in savings for typical gasoline users. Burlington Electric Department recently pioneered an additional EV incentive specifically for these high mileage drivers to help the people who are driving the most miles transition to EVs. And pass back over to Lena.
Awesome. So yeah, we've been talking a lot about how Vermonters can save money on the actual fuel costs when switching to an EV, but we wanted to highlight savings when accounting for the upfront purchase cost of the vehicle as well. So as you can see on this graph here, before factoring in incentives or rebates or tax credits, the price of a Volkswagen ID4 is higher than the gasoline equivalent Volkswagen Tiguan. But we can still see that even with that higher upfront cost, because of the fuel savings over the lifetime of the vehicle and savings on maintenance costs, the lifetime cost to operate the vehicle is still lower with an electric vehicle. And it's lower by a small amount without the incentives factored in, but when you do factor in those incentives and rebates, the savings over the lifetime of the vehicle are much more significant. Go to the next slide. We also know that about 2/3 of Vermonters purchase used rather than new vehicles, and thankfully there are incentives available as well for the purchase of used EVs. So the table on the top of this slide shows how those incentives for used EVs can stack up to bring down the upfront cost of a used 2022 Chevy Bolt. And those savings or incentives can stack up to be anywhere from $4,000 to $17,000 or almost $17,000, depending on the utility and incentive eligibility. And prioritizing equity really means ensuring that Vermonters with lower incomes who often face the highest energy cost burdens, as Cara touched on before, are able to participate in the transition and benefit from the opportunity to save money when switching to an EV. So these two pie charts on the bottom show Vermont state incentives for new EVs by income level. So since July 2022, around 2,400 Vermonters have received state incentives for the purchase of a new EV. And of those 2,400 rebates, over half of them, the rebates themselves went to lower income households. So that's what's shown on the left side pie chart. On the right side, we can see that because the state provides a larger rebate to income qualifying households, that translates to more than 70% of the total funding dollars going to households with lower incomes. And lastly, as Jared touched on earlier in the presentation, transitioning away from fossil fuels also benefits the state economy as a whole by relocalizing our energy dollars. Fossil fuels create a significant drain on Vermont's economy, with 75% of the dollars spent on fossil fuels leaving the state, and that is shown on the left side here. This amounted to a $1.7 billion drain on Vermont's $43 billion economy in 2023. In contrast, spending energy dollars on electricity essentially flips that ratio, keeping a much higher share of our energy dollars in Vermont, recirculating in the state and supporting local jobs. So moving now into key finding 5. And that is that Vermont is often a leader on climate action and clean energy, but there are areas where Vermont is lagging behind other states. So starting off with where Vermont is leading. Vermont has a history of leadership on climate action, energy efficiency, and clean energy. As a few examples shown in the pictures here and on this table on the next slide. Vermont was one of the first, or the first state to pass a Climate Superfund Act requiring fossil fuel companies to pay for climate damages. Vermont has the highest number of EV chargers per capita in the country and the highest number of heat pumps installed per capita in New England. And not going to read through the whole list, but this is in the report to check out. And then looking more closely at EV registrations in Vermont, as you could see on the table on the previous slide, I don't know if you were able to see it because I went through it pretty quickly, but Vermont has the highest number of EVs per capita in New England. And the number of EVs that are registered in the state has nearly doubled since 2021. The number of EVs registered as of 2023. So as you can see on the graph here, we're showing the total number of EVs in 2023, or as of the end of 2023. But that has increased to just over 15,000 as of July 2024. Despite this, at the end of 2023, EVs represented just over 2% of the total light-duty fleet in Vermont. So while we're seeing this significant growth over the last several years, it's still a small share of the total number of vehicles in the state. And also shown on this graph, the pathways analysis, which was completed for the development of the initial Vermont Climate Action Plan in 2021, projected that the state will need to significantly ramp up EV adoption through 2030 to meet our climate commitments, so that the needed increase in registrations is shown there. Another key point I wanted to pull out from that table is that Vermont has the least carbon intensive electricity portfolio in the US. Our electricity portfolio is very clean relative to other states, and that is based on retirements of renewable energy credits. So that is what is shown on the pie chart on the left is Vermont's electricity portfolio after accounting for those for retirements and trading of renewable energy credits. And Vermont's electricity portfolio is also only expected to become more clean and more renewable over time, especially with the adoption of the updated renewable energy standard earlier this year, which will require the state to achieve 100% renewable electricity by 2035, in addition to also increasing the share of our electricity that comes from small-scale in-state renewable sources. So what's graphed on the right side here is a comparison of the previous renewable energy standard with the updated RES that was passed earlier this year. And back to Jared.
Thanks, Lena. So continuing, while, as Lena said, there are many ways in which Vermont has been leading on efficiency, clean energy, and climate action, there are also key ways that we are lagging. And this table shows some of those, including that we have the second highest amount of climate pollution produced per person of any state in New England, that we do not yet have a cap on climate pollution outside of the electricity sector, and there are others that you can read here. Going to the next slide, this analysis, unfortunately, we are only able to compare all of the New England states through 2019. That's the latest year for which we have greenhouse gas inventory data for every New England state. One of the things that we're hoping to do for next year's annual progress report is to be able to update this analysis to go through 2021. But as of the latest data, as I said, Vermont has the second highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in New England and has made the least progress to date in reducing our emissions below 2005 levels, which is important relative to the Paris Climate Agreement that the United States committed to, and that is reflected in our legal obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act. So on the next slide, Lena mentioned earlier that Vermont is not currently on track to meet our emissions reduction obligations under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And it's important to note that this is not because we don't have the available technology. It is primarily because we are not utilizing the evidence-based policy and regulatory solutions that are available to us and that have been recommended in Vermont's Climate Action Plan. So this table compares what is happening here in Vermont versus other states. And you can see that there are states that are taking a more comprehensive approach across the board, and that this is an area of continued policy development. And the number of those orange outlined checks are not completed. There is a lot of this work that continues to be in development, both here in Vermont and across the country. But what we know is that the existing economic dominance of fossil fuels in Vermont and beyond requires policy and regulation to intentionally transform markets, especially if we're to create an energy transition that is more just and equitable. So incentives are certainly necessary to help encourage change, but they are insufficient on their own. And the example that we see from other states that have made more progress than us is that comprehensive policies and targeted regulations are also necessary to help shift markets and ensure the scale and pace of progress that is necessary both for Vermont to meet science-based targets and do our part to reduce pollution, but also to fully seize the cost-saving opportunities that can go along with efficiency and clean energy transitions. And we see that the places that are making the most progress are taking this more comprehensive approach. And that includes three elements: performance standards for energy equipment and importers of fossil fuels, caps on emissions from the highest polluting sectors. Right now in Vermont, we only have a cap on pollution from the electricity sector, but not on other sectors, including the thermal and transportation sectors. And then, of course, investments in equity-focused pollution-reducing programs and incentives. So this is helpful to be able to see, as compared to other places. Unlike Quebec, California, Washington, Oregon, and New York, Vermont has yet to establish or commit to a cap on emissions from our most polluting sectors. And while we have successfully made some investments in equity-focused incentives, that's just one leg of the stool. An important leg, but just one. And without those other two legs, in terms of caps and performance standards, we believe that we will have little chance to achieve our climate commitments and energy goals. And we can see an example of this on this graph, which looks at emissions from the electricity sector over time. When we talk about performance standards and emissions caps, those are two things that are present in the Vermont's electricity sector. So in 2015, the Renewable Energy Standard, which is a performance standard for electric utilities, was passed. That was just updated last year, as Lena outlined. And we are also part of a regional emissions cap from the electricity sector, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And those have contributed, along with other factors, towards the very significant decline that you see on the right-hand side of this graph. So much so that Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity sector declined 66% between 2005 and 2001. And resulting in the electricity sector becoming the only sector measured in the state's greenhouse gas emissions inventory that has already met its proportional share of emissions reduction in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act. It's the only sector that has yet done so. It's clear that policy and regulation has played a key role there. And we can see this by looking back at this slide that was shown earlier of emissions by sector. The electricity one is there on the far right in blue, where we've seen a significant and durable decline. But in the sectors where we have not done as much via policy and regulation to help address emissions, we see declines that have been much less. And as was mentioned earlier, the thermal sector continues to be the place where high amounts of pollution are very durable, and emissions have only declined in that sector 8% since 2005, and that is the main reason, or along with some others, but that is a key reason why we are not currently on track to meet legal obligations and moral responsibilities that we have committed to. So with that, that's the end of our graphs and slides. We wanted to thank all of you for joining. I want to pause and say this report, it looks very quick and easy, but it was the result of a 9-month, incredibly in-depth team effort, 50 reviewers across the state, and some of whom are on this call. Thank you so much for that. And we will start answering questions in the chat in a moment, but before we do that, I want to share that this report and all of the graphics that you just saw and some others that you didn't see are now available for distribution and use on our website. If you are on our mailing list, you should receive a physical copy in the next week or two. In terms of our free downloadable graphics that are on our website, we welcome you to use those for your own newsletters or presentations. We produce this for the state of Vermont, for our network of members, to be a free open source resource, to make sure that we're having data-informed, fact-based conversations about Vermont's energy future. We also have, thanks to Lena's really good work, a lot of this is thanks to Lena's really good work, but in particular, a social media toolkit. If there are specific graphics or summaries from this report that you'd like to share on your social media of choice, that is made easy for you with that social media toolkit. We are also happy to schedule presentations and discussions with your organization or community. So if you'd like to schedule a presentation and discussion with us, we'd love to join you. Please reach out and let us know. And then finally, we are always looking to improve this work, to understand how you're hearing it, how it's valuable to you, what's confusing to you. So if you have constructive feedback on this, we always want to hear it, whether it's right now or just, you notice something in the future. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out. This is, as with everything, always a work in progress, always trying to improve, and we appreciate that constructive feedback. So with that, we'd like to respond to your questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Kara for facilitating that.
Yeah, thanks to all of you who have put some questions in the chat. If you have additional questions, feel free to continue putting those in there or raising a hand, and we can get around to folks who raise their hand as well. I'm going to start with this first question from Barry, and that I'm going to, I think, direct towards Jared. The question is, do we know what % of transportation use would be met if we electrified all commercial vehicles in Vermont and right-sized school buses?
So we haven't done that calculation. One slide that I believe Lena showed that would be a shorthand way to look at that is the % of emissions that come from the light duty versus the heavy duty fleet. passenger vehicles versus commercial vehicles isn't an exact overlay with light duty versus heavy duty, but I think that a big challenge is that the vast majority of our fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation come from passenger vehicles, come from the light duty fleet. And so while there are certainly opportunities that are valuable and that can make a positive impact in terms of electrifying the commercial fleets, heavy duty vehicles, in terms of different transit options and ways to reduce vehicle miles traveled, in terms of getting at the bulk of the emissions, it will require reducing vehicle miles traveled and electrifying the passenger fleet and the light duty fleet, where those may be smaller vehicles, but added up across all of their gasoline use, it's a far larger amount of fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions than is happening commercially. And I would invite Lena or Cara to add anything.
Nope, thanks. I'm going to direct this next question to Lena. It's also from Barry, and he pointed out that battery storage increased 52% in our report, but it represents only about 5% of the total electric base load. I'm wondering if you want to go back to slide 11, Lena, and talk a little bit about the role of battery storage in the total picture of flexible load management, because we do have a graph about that as well.
Slide 11, yeah. So just to clarify here, I think you might be referring to this 52%, and that is not showing the increase over time, but actually the share of the 2023 storage capacity that is utility scale versus small scale or residential. So that 52% of the megawatts of storage capacity is utility scale storage. But yeah, I think that's a really great point to point out what that is relative to our overall electricity load. And you're correct that it is small still. But I think that it's encouraging to see how much it's been increasing over the last several years.
And I think I might add in that when we talk to the utilities about the needs for increased storage, they also say it's not just that. It's all of the flexible load management programs. It's managed charging of cars. It is preheating and pre-cooling of buildings. It's part of a full package that helps to stabilize the electric grid and bring down peak loads. Jared, is there anything else you'd want to add to that one?
That sounds great.
Okay, good. Okay, Jared, I'm going to direct this question at you. It's from Sarah. She asks, when will we know if we reach or how close we get to the 2025 emission reduction requirements, if the latest data we have is from 2021?
Thanks, Sarah. That is a great question. A couple of things there. One is, we often, whether in the media or just in conversation, we hear about the 2025 emissions reduction target. And you, in posing your question, rightly noted that is a January 1st, 2025 emissions reduction target, which legally, to meet a January 1st target, since we measure emissions on an annual basis, what that really refers to is our 2024 annual emissions. Usually the state's greenhouse gas inventory is on about a 3-year delay. That's primarily because of delays in reporting agricultural sector emissions, for which we rely on EPA state inventory tools. That said, the vast majority of emissions we actually know far sooner than that. And we know, the way that Vermont estimates greenhouse gas emissions from its two most polluting sectors, transportation and thermal, are based on fuel sales data that we get from the tax department that for 2024 will be ready in February of 2025. We will also have data for 2024 from the electricity sector, soon after, certainly not on a 3-year delay. So it will be possible to calculate, and we plan to do this in early 2025, the emissions from the majority of our emissions sources, which can tell us mathematically whether it's possible that we met the 2024, the annual 2024 requirement as compared to historical emissions and what's likely happening in other sectors. Definitively, in terms of a 100% complete and comprehensive inventory for the year 2024, it's possible that that will not be available until 2026 or 2027. But we do believe that we know that we have access to the vast majority of data that goes into our 2024 annual emissions from the tax department and fossil fuel sales. And that can be really instructive to give us an early sense of whether or not it is possible that we met the target or came close or not. Our current assessment based on the data for 2023 is that it is exceedingly unlikely that we will meet that first requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act, unfortunately.
Sarah, do you want to have a follow-up question?
Yeah, so Jared, it's great that you have a large portion. If you have transportation and thermal, you have a big portion. And I can understand agriculture taking longer. But can you give us a sense? So you must have 22 and 23 for thermal and transportation. And based on those, plus perhaps some of the other smaller ones, can you at least tell us whether or not, I mean, from 20 to 21, we went up, and I don't remember the numbers, but it was 7 point something, and now we're 8 point something.
Yeah.
And so that's very distressing to see that go up. And I assume it probably was coming out of COVID, maybe the shutdown in 2020, and then coming out. So the real question in my mind, quite aside from how close are we going to get to the 2025 goal, which will tell us something about the 2030 goal too, but are we at least going back down, or based on the thermal and the transportation that you have for 22 and 23, have we started to go back down on those two, especially with the uptick with electric vehicles and even the less perfect plug-ins and plane hybrids?
Yeah, it's a great question and an important point. One just quick note is that in terms of that 2020, that increase in emissions between 2020 and 2021 that you mentioned, Sarah, the leading factor in that was an increase in gasoline sales and higher transportation sector emissions from 2020 to 2021. We looked more carefully at the fuel sales data in both the transportation and thermal sectors in a recent research paper that we published last or in the spring, looking at Vermont's changing thermal sector, but we also included some of the data from the transportation sector there. So I don't know if Lena, if you can grab that, but I think that some of the analysis you're looking for about an early look at what's happening in the transportation and thermal sectors with regard to fuel sales and emissions is in that paper. We didn't include that in this report. One of the reasons, this is just kind of a flag, kind of a caution, is that this year, the Agency of Natural Resources, I believe rightly so, made a methodology change where dyed diesel that is used primarily for things like logging, for farm equipment, in railroads, that had historically been counted in the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, so thermal sector emissions. This year, they changed that and moved those over to transportation sector emissions. So if you look at the inventory from ANR that was just published earlier this year, you'll see higher transportation sector emissions and lower thermal sector emissions than had previously been the case. And that was because of that move of the dyed diesel, which we didn't reflect in that research paper because that methodology change had not been made yet. So just want you to be, and others to be aware of that. We are planning to update our analysis to incorporate that new methodology and incorporate the 2024 tax department data as soon as we can in the late winter, early spring of 2025. And we'll look forward to sharing that.
Thank you. You have other questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, David Mullet asks, does EAN rely fully on the Velco load forecast in projecting the state's progress and compliance in future years, or are there other forecasts taken into account? Lena, is that a question you'd like to take?
Sure. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if you're asking about, and please feel free to chime in if I'm not answering the question, but I believe that you're referring to this graph here with the peak load forecast from Velco. And in terms of looking at forecasted electricity loads, we do rely fully on the Velco long-range transmission plan. And it's not something that we're using to, I don't know if that question was related to GHG emissions in any way, but on that, it's not something that we're using to make projections or forecasts about emissions. It's just what we're using for this graph here. I hope that answers.
No, I think you've answered it, and I appreciate it. It's just such a big picture question. If we need twice as much electricity as we think we do to achieve electrification, it impacts everything around pricing, progress, programs, and the whole works. And it's kind of, in a way, if not question one, at least question 1A, as we think about the system as a whole and so many facets of the future. So that's, I was just trying to understand what tools you do or don't use and how it factors into your analysis.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, there is a final question here, Jared. I'm going to direct this at you. Again, from Barry, pointing out there's a segment of the environmental community that wants to shut down the 2 wood chip electric baseload generating plants in Vermont, and asking what baseload options are realistic to replace those sources with baseload renewables. Do you comment? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would defer to others in the electricity and utility space on the specifics of that. One thing I would say that, I think we always try to approach our work and analysis at EAN with is the question of compared to what. So if we are going to identify something as a challenge or a problem, I think it is important that we look at what are the alternatives and what are the pros and cons or costs and benefits or risks and opportunities of those alternatives. So that's not really specific to this question. It's just, I think it is relevant to this question, but I think it's also relevant to how we approach all of our work, is that it is important to always look at the compared to what question. And, I do think that that's especially a relevant question in the electricity space, but also elsewhere.
Thanks. I want to thank all of you for spending an hour with us. We're very excited to share the report with you. And as you get your hands on a physical copy and have a chance to read every word, we'd love to hear your responses and your further questions. And we'd love to bring presentations elsewhere if you know groups that would like to hear more about this. So thank you so much for being with us. And have a good afternoon.